Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday, July 20th, which means a lot of things for me. Paul, Dan, you might appreciate this. It's the day before I get to buy Bruce Springsteen tickets. He's coming
Oh
to
my
St. Paul
goodness.
in March and tomorrow. So all day long, I'm reminding myself with alerts that tomorrow I have to, get on and fight with other people on the internet to get first in line to buy Bruce Springsteen tickets. But we're not going to talk about great Bruce Springsteen music today. Probably do that tomorrow. I'll just allude to it. But we will check in with Paul Martin, who's going to be our guest today, introduce him in a minute. But we're going to tell you about the weather in Minneapolis. It's summer and it's great. Just a proud day to be living where we live. The sun's big, the sun's bright. Sure, I'm buried in a basement, but we'll get back out there. Paul Martin, you're in Southern California, down in the San Diego area?
Orange County, yes, Southern California.
How is it? How's the summer weather in Orange County, my friend?
The weather is Southern California. It's mild, and we do have this thing called June gloom, and it lasts sometimes into July. So by the coast, it's gray. It's basically steam because our water is cooler and the sun is warm, and so by about noon, it clears up. But it's wonderful.
Chasing off the gloom. Hey, Dan, producer Dan, how are things looking in South Bend?
It is still hot, humid, but it's been worse. So
it's a great attitude. Paul, one of the reasons we love to chat about the weather at the beginning is because it's the one thing we actually do share, right? Like we're going to all have different thoughts in our heads, different stories we're living, different desires for the world. But you walk outside and you and your neighbor at least share that. So it's a great common point to remember, hey, that's a thing, and the planet matters, and what's going on around us.
For now, it matters. Perhaps in days not too far from now, people will even be debating the weather. Whether, no pun intended, it's hot or cold or left or right or who knows.
So it is funny that you bring that up. I was in a conversation with my in-laws, and we were talking about how percentages of rain are determined. Like, what does it mean when it says 40% chance of rain? And there's a complicated but pretty clear answer to what that is. It means that in a given area that there's a chance of rain in 40% of the area. It's not about like your chance of winning the lottery. It's about rain in what portion of the area. Most people don't know this, right? They get confused. So if you Google like how is percentage of rain chances put together, it takes you to lots of places, including a Wikipedia article. And we had this little short conversation about this, and people are like, oh, that's just BS when I was saying, I'm like, okay, here's the Wikipedia article description. It says it more clear, and I read it. And then someone in the in-law family says, well, it's Wikipedia. Who wrote that crap? You don't even know. You can't even trust Wikipedia. Like there it is, right? As soon as you disagree with an idea, you just go right after the source.
Yeah,
because
the internet told me.
Yeah, the internet told me it's unreliable, which is something we're going to talk about today because our conversation today is around the conflict in the United States. For some people is all about policy. So we think about a series of topics. You've put out a great YouTube video on this, from guns and choice and reproductive freedoms and inflation and military and spending and all kinds of things. But that's not really where the divide has ever been in the United States. You articulate this. I agree that it's more about identity and how people see themselves, and this liberal, conservative, progressive, conservative, left, right wing divide is really not about individual topics and ideas. It's about how people see the world. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I think it really matters. Your background's interesting. You work in faith spaces. You have pastored churches. You've run for Congress as a more progressively leaning Republican in 2018 in Southern California. You have worked in, still consult with nonprofit groups. What else about your background is important for people to know as they hear you talking about these issues with us today?
A couple of things I think that are unique. People wouldn't know this, but I come from an immigrant family. My mother immigrated from Italy as a teenager. My father is Mexican. My last name is more like Ricky Martin's last name. So my last name is Martin, predominantly Spanish. But I came from a home with very much, son of immigrants. And what came along with that, and I didn't know it at the time, is my mother and father experienced forms of discrimination growing up. My father still remembers no Mexican signs here in Orange County, and was lucky enough, he's a lighter Mexican, to have gone to a segregated school for lighter skinned people, where most all of his family and friends that were Mexicans went to the school for dark skinned people. And of course, in the 1950s, when my mother immigrated from Italy, there were conspiracy theories, as we know, even in the 50s, and one of them was that the Pope and Rome was trying to infiltrate the United States. And so my mother was, she had so many accounts of being heckled for being a guinea, a wop. And also
Mm.
there was this anti-Italian thing. So even though I look like a typical white guy, and I guess that I am, I have a fairly rich history with parents that understood some of the issues we'll talk about in a bit.
Mm. Well, that's super helpful, and it's true, right? We all bring stories that run deeper than simply what our appearances are, and that's a really important part of understanding. So you've launched this YouTube channel, and you mentioned a couple of times in the video that I saw that it's a self-help channel, or it's a personal benefit channel, but it talks about important issues that are going on in people's heads, right? Like how they think about the world and how that contrasts with others. Can you just give us a quick recap of this video that led us to this conversation that you put up? What's your thesis in that video about what we're facing in the United States and this dilemma that you think we need to understand in order to be better for ourselves and better with each other?
Yes. Well, two things. I think on the self-help, I figured what we probably don't need is another talking head expounding on the political climate. I mean, there are people that would do that
Right.
far better than I
We've
would.
got we've got that covered. Glad
You've
to
got
do
it
that, right?
covered.
Be the
Well, no,
talking
I'm
heads
I'm
just
I'm serious, Doug, and I've watched some, tremendous uh, progress, even with your work and other groups, and I thought, no matter what, and I say this in my first video, the one that you saw was my second, was in the very best case in 2022, even for a person that's non-political, there is somebody living rent free in their head.
nice.
Even for the non-political people, they can't believe that Roe versus Wade was overturned. They might not be political, but there is some idea living rent free in their head. That's the best case, or an uncle, or an aunt, or a brother, or a sister who's pro-Trump or doesn't believe that Biden's senile, right? So in the best case, we're more bothered, and that stresses relationships. Forget about riots in the Capitol. We are living
Yeah.
in a time where our relationships, which matter most, every study ever done in the history of studies on happiness will say that relationships are king and queen. And
Mm.
so I wanted to kind of root this a little bit more in the practical. This political unrest, this social unrest, is affecting people in a really basic way. And then, of course, there are much bigger issues like insurrections in our capital, and in that case, it's affecting us in a really big way. In my last video that you saw, just very quickly, um, and I say that, nobody's losing sleep or having relationships end over higher gas prices.
Right.
It's inconvenient, and I know that for people who live, closer to the poverty line, it could be in many cases, um, you know, devastating in a way. But gas prices or global warming or healthcare, people are not dying over things that could be legislated through a new law. But that's very different when it
Mm.
comes to issues surrounding identity, race, ethnicity, sexual expression. I mean, there are basically two camps. And one camp celebrates. They have parades around America being about self-expression and diversity. And you have another group that thinks that that very celebration is what's destroying the country. And some are willing to go to war over it.
Yeah. And it's really a question of power, isn't it? Like it's not not debatable if there's difference in America. We know there's different cultural backgrounds. We know there's different races. We know people live differently. There's different sexual structures. There's all kinds of stuff going on. The question is, whose country is it? Who's in control? Who gets to set the agenda? And that is really where the struggle comes. And you reference, and some other people have even said, we heard from the January 6th hearings last week, somebody that was part of the Proud Boys and or the Oath Keepers organization, that they're really trying to foment a civil war. That kind of thing's been going on for a long time. You and I are probably both of the age that we remember the country's fascination with Helter Skelter, with the murders in California, done by what's the guy's name? No, I forgot his name. How is that?
Manson.
Yeah.
Charles Manson.
Thank you, Charles Manson. And if you remember that whole thing, they wrote a bunch of racial words with the blood of the people. This horrible story that for 40, 50 years has captured the American psyche about how bad it. And it was designed to fuel a race war, right? That it was trying to bring about this conflict. There have been people seeing these divides for a very long time, trying to wedge apart the country. My own opinion is no one has had the level of impact that Donald Trump and the Trump administration has had on making that happen, because we've never had someone at his level of national influence and authority doing such things. So we are in a different moment here, but the conditions have been in place for a long time. And that is that liberals and conservatives feel that there's an existential threat if the other group is in charge. If the other group has power, whatever power you have is going to be taken from you. Like that question. And again, that has been going on we had a civil war over this. We've had quiet civil wars for a long time. We ended up putting in, Jim Crow laws in the South because there were a lot of people in the United States who didn't want freed slaves to then have equal power, because if they have power, we don't. So it's a very powerful zero-sum game. But it goes on in the background of the thinking of a whole lot of people in this country. And when it comes out publicly or in social spaces or between relatives or friends, it's really scary for people to hear how deeply we fear one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, which is so much of this. You said something just 30 seconds ago about below the surface. We all know that um, most of our thoughts are subconscious thoughts. If someone's thrown around
Yeah.
10% versus 90%, like an iceberg, right? 90% of it. But I'm absolutely convinced that much of the fear on the right is subconscious fear. It's this kind of subconscious and we have to talk about tribalism as well, because tribalism is part of our evolutionary history. We want to be with our tribes. We like our sports teams, but it's benign for me to like my alma mater, UCLA, and be loyal to my college alma mater. It is not benign to be as loyal to my political party as we saw on January 6th. And that's a distinction, again, I don't think is being the psychology of tribalism, I think is very connected to this. I think many of these people on the right, and I consider myself a Republican still, in the sense of I believe in the classical social contract of republics. I do like the general idea. As someone who's worked a lot in Washington, D.C., I do not think that the federal government is always the most efficient instrument for implementing change. I like Ben and Jerry's and Patagonia and companies that are out there doing good that aren't being regulated. But I'm going around a bit. But I guess my point is much of this fear that you refer to is subconscious. It's not for the Proud Boys and it's not for the Oath Keeper,
Right.
but it most certainly is for these people in our communities that really don't know why they will vote Republican no matter what. But I think in there is a blend of tribalism and then kind of fear over this identity issue that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it is real. Look, people truly believe, and on, I have real fears that if someone like Donald Trump becomes the president again after all that he's done and this country gives its stamp of approval and selection, that's going to say something to us that's going to harm this country in a way that we won't ever. It'll be a scar in this country that will dictate the future, and I'm terrified of it. Now, some people who hear me say that, and they've told me, loved ones and others, like, dude, you're unbelievably worried about that. Like, it's going to be okay, even if it's Trump. Look at what happened over the last 4 years, 5 years. Sure, he came in, did all this terrible stuff. But look, we're all still here. The sun's still shining. You still talk about the weather at the start of every podcast. People still love each other. Your grandchildren are still growing. Like, it's okay. Stop being so alarmist about what the possibilities are. And I'm like, no, that's not actually true. He's truly harming, like, right. So I am
Yeah.
locked in on what I see as the danger, right? I don't think it's irrational. I think it's rooted. So to myself, I see myself as totally reasonable. I've sat in a bar arguing with Proud Boys just before Trump's election, and they're telling me about what terrible things will happen if Black Lives Matter leaders and Joe Biden become the president of the United States and has this power. And they're convinced that this entire cascade of the de-evolution of the family and of the capitalist system and the economy, like, they are equally as paranoid as I am if Trump were to ever get it. So this is the place where we find ourselves, right? And I don't think I'm being unreasonable. I think there's true, real damage that will come, and the future of America is not determined. It's in our hands, uh, and yet other people would see. Well, I've been around the religion world long enough, where people say that folks like me ruin religion, can break Christianity, which I think is unbreakable because it's all kinds of reasons. So this conflict that exists between us, that the civil unrest is not so much about what do we view the government. And this is why, for me, some of the old schooly Republicans like talking about, I just want to limit government influence. Like, okay, I just don't think regulation's the thing any of us really need to be all that worried about. I think the government's desire to limit human interaction with each other is really scary. And funny enough, I see Trump as fascist, and the people who hate Biden see Biden as a fascist. Like, we both throw those things around, seeing one another as the true existential threat. Now, I would say I think my opinion has some better views around it, that it actually is more dangerous, and it's been proven to be so. Unite the Right rallies, insurrections, kids in cages, just go down the list. And this other story of you're going to lose your capitalism, and you're not going to have families anymore, and churches aren't going to be able to worship, and all that seems to be just rooted in nothing other than fear. How do you respond to something like that? Because I don't think you see yourself in quite the alarmist space that I see myself in, if Republicans are ever in charge again. But so how do you wrestle with this?
Well, first, I absolutely do see it as an existential threat. Uh, if Trump, given what happened, was reelected, I think this whole project could collapse. I was speaking to one of my Republican friends the other day, and I said, but did you watch the hearings? And he said, well, I don't really have any feelings. He hasn't been convicted. And I just keep thinking of Watergate. I mean, just the way the structure of our government works. It begins with hearings. That's the way our system with checks and balances works. And at the time, I think 3 or 4 months before uh, Nixon resigned, I think 70 to 80% of Republicans still supported him. And so I said to my friend, I mean, just forget what you're hearing on Fox News. He sat in the Oval Office for hours as the nation's capital was being stormed with smoke and guns and nooses and, all these things. And his number one oath of office, the first thing is our national protector, right? These are what
Yeah.
presidents do. They take this oath to protect. And I again, it's one of these conversations where there's this kind of false equivalency kind of
Yeah.
thing because well, look at all the Antifa crime, and I'm like, Antifa or whatever they call it. And I'm thinking, I mean, we can go back, a few years or a few decades, and how many mass shootings in schools or churches, or how many people were lynched in the right? We can, the evidence is overwhelming that it's been the right that has been militant. Sure,
Yeah.
Black Lives Matter march, but again, if we're talking about manifestos being written by mass shooters in Texas,
Yeah.
racist manifestos. There isn't an argument or the commander in chief of the United States of America sitting in his White House kitchen for hours as the nation was being sacked by a bunch of terrorists, 315 who have confessed to their crimes. And again, trying to have that
Yeah.
we're talking about brute facts. The guy that got in front of the hearings was a Proud Boy. He was the head of their communications. He worked like this with their founder. And yet, again, it's this kind of tribalism that you see with people I personally, as a Republican, people on the right, except for Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and these people that actually have free thoughts. It is a great threat. And why more Republicans aren't concerned is baffling. But I hear that those numbers are starting to change, right?
I think so. I think they are. And look, I'm no historian, and I was raised in Minnesota, and so we didn't think a lot about the Civil War here, really, other than we're the good guys, and there were people on the bad guy side. But as I've paid attention as an adult to what went on in the Civil War, when there was no accountability for states seceding from the Union and then unleashing a devastating, murderous war called the Civil War, killed more Americans than any other war, just brutal for 4 years. And then at the end of that, those same generals and leaders were just brought into the Senate and into Congress, and we never reconciled it. There was never a price paid. In fact, monuments have been put inside of the US Capitol remembering them. Like, we don't tend to critique the very actions that we saw on January 6th and so on. So there's a long history in the United States of not reconciling with these bad and actually turning these folks into heroes. So somewhere in the 1970s in Minnesota at Meadowbrook Elementary School in Golden Valley, I'm learning the song Dixie. I wish I was in the land of cotton where old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away. I'm like, why am I singing a Civil War, Confederate song? It's just unbelievable. Like, we tell ourselves right now, we will never forget. This is going to be a big thing. And yet we don't reconcile these dilemmas. Like, we don't have an ability in the public psyche even to deal with slavery or to deal with dropping of nuclear weapons. Like, the ability to critique America's own actions, very low, right, in our public psyche, which seems like has something to do, and you could do the same, I guess, if you found people on the other side of the political spectrum doing such things. I don't have that list. I can't seem to find anything that's even remotely close, right? Like when someone's like, oh, they burned the Wells Fargo in Minneapolis. I'm like, okay. And as it turns out, no, they didn't. They arrested the people who did that. And do you know who it was? White supremacists that came into Minnesota and were trying to stir up a Charles Manson-like race war. So that it was even those actions were done by that same crowd, right? So all of that to say, we're not prone in this country to have a narrative of let's reconcile this. Like, let's really deal with the issues. Let's really talk about them. Instead, we get confused about who heroes are. And we always see ourselves as the heroes, right? No matter which side you're on, no matter what you've done, there's a way you see yourself as a hero. And that seems like it's sort of a piece of what I felt like you were getting at in your video and trying to raise this question of, look, liberals and conservatives are not just political ideas. They're like moral, psychological categories that really keep us separated from each other. And if we don't know that and recognize that, we're never going to actually be able to deal with these issues in our society. And I'm kind of wondering, do we want to deal with these issues in our society, or do we just teeter totter back and forth between which side has more political power?
I mean, couldn't agree with everything that you said more. And it seems to me that the right, there's a fascinating documentary that you might have seen. It's Ken Burns's Vietnam, and it's 20 hours of Ken Burns just going all the way from World War II until us withdrawing from Vietnam. And there's a section where they're looking at the anti-war protesters, and they're getting into the whole broad way in which young, and I say this in my video, young people are saying to their government,
Mhm.
no, this is new for us, right? Because there used to be this idea of patriotism and blah 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 blah. And what's fascinating about this little moment is he actually shows, and I didn't know this group existed in the way that it did, but these anti-war protesters, everybody knew Vietnam was a mess in 1970.
Yeah.
Everybody knew that this was a waste. People were dying. Everyone knew we didn't want our boys dying anymore in a war that had nothing to do with the purpose of
Yeah.
going in. But there was a right wing
Mhm.
response to these protesters. And I kind of knew that. But when you see the video of these Republicans, these patriots, that's the word, to question your government, to be anti-war, you are a pinko now, right?
Oh.
You are a pro-communist. And it seems like the Republican Party, when we get to this idea of patriotism, and this is
Mm.
what I was trying to do in my video, when we see that flag,
Mm.
this is kind of a metaphysical question. What does America mean? And this is the problem,
Yeah.
because on the right, it means this kind of unyielding loyalty no matter what. No matter what, we don't want to talk about these problems. We want to stop talking about race. We don't even want to teach our kids in certain states. We don't want to use the word slavery anymore because that makes us look bad.
Yeah.
Where if you are a realist, and hey, this country has done great things. I'll never forget. I saw and by the way, you brought up the Springsteen tour. I will be fighting you on on in the digital world tomorrow. I can't
Yeah.
even wait. Didn't realize that you were a fan, but oh man, where was I going? Oh, I lost my train of
Mhm.
thought.
That's right. Let's talk about Bruce Springsteen music for an hour. We can do
That's
that. We can
true.
do that easy enough.
Yes, absolutely. Um,
No,
yeah. So this
I think you
idea
were
is,
saying
I
that
think.
you got it? You got your thought back? Because
No,
I
I
think where
don't.
you were going was that one notion on the right is that there's unflinching respect for whatever we've done in the United States because goodness came from it, so any harm that has
Right.
also come is
Yeah. And it reminds me, the Republican Party, of which I'm a part, reminds me of a highly dysfunctional family where you just don't
Mm,
talk about the problems.
yeah.
You just, no, that's being disloyal. And I know a thing or two about this firsthand, unfortunately. Uh, Bono is at the Rose Bowl in front of 100,000 people, and Bono is not some right wing ideologue by any stretch. But I'll never forget him saying this. He said, America, you have been so good. I have worked around the world, especially in Africa, and your generosity is
Mm,
unparalleled. Now, I thought that was a very special moment because people like Bono are oftentimes castigated or swept aside as being liberal or progressive. But this has been, generally speaking, a generous nation when it comes to giving, especially financially, in other parts of the world. But it seems like the Republican Party takes it as disloyal, to be
mhm.
honest.
Yeah,
So the
nice.
woke movement, of which I consider myself a part, to me is just, it's kind of like Socrates, like know thyself. Like, let's be honest with ourselves as a nation. We've done some really bad things with slaves and Chinese and Mexicans and Japanese, and we've done some really good things. But let's be honest with ourselves. That is a conversation that the far right does not want to have because
Yeah,
it's
and America
unpatriotic.
doesn't wanna have too, right? I mean, overall, like, we tend not to. Um, there's a side of the other part of the American culture that w wants to remind us of the failures of our country, which are legion, internal to our country, work internationally, and therefore, nothing that we ever do should be considered penance to make this country good. So
Mhm.
good and bad, we're moral, we're not moral. Some people wanna say we're everything is good no matter what, because we've done enough good to weigh the balance. Some people want to say there's this other balance. Some people want to say, let's just stop using those categories at all. Let's stop putting a conclusion on these things, right? That's actually where I'm finding myself now, because the more you spend time in this area is just to say, look, the United States, this idea of moral goodness, it's a myth. It's a myth internally to our own lives. It doesn't work well when you're like, are you a good person or a bad person? Why do good people go here and bad people go? Like that notion, good people, bad people. I don't know, spend a little time around people and you're like, you know what people are? Complicated people. People do
Yes,
stuff that
I love
doesn't make
that.
sense. Right. So I have a lot of
Yes.
friends that really despise Bill Clinton's coining of the kind of phrase, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be solved by what's good with America. Right. That kind of idea. Like but we're going to overcome it and we're ultimately going to be good. Barack Obama was famous for that kind of thing too. Like, yes, we're going to recognize this, but the greatness of America, I don't know. We need something in our lexicon that doesn't put moral goodness and moral depravity at the on the balance. Okay, can I show this video that we talked about earlier? This is a video that I have
Please.
watched so many times, and I'm not sure why I keep watching it, other than it reminds me, and it's powerful. It's this minute and a half long clip of men who broke into the United States Capitol in the insurrection, and they're inside the United States Senate dais. They've taken it over. The Capitol Police are in the room with them, not driving them out, sort of feeling overwhelmed because there's a bunch of these guys are in there and they don't know what to do. And I think there's a lot of sympathies inside those Capitol Police movement too. So it's my own opinion to these guys. And they pray this prayer inside the Senate dais. That is a prayer extremely familiar to those of us from certain religious traditions. We recognize the cadence, we recognize some of the verbiage, recognize the words as big invocation that they've come in the name of Jesus. What you will notice in it, if you've never seen it, for other viewers, it's a little shocking, but you watch how they demonize a group of people. They name, categorize them, and then see themselves as the heroes. That we are the people bringing love. We are the people walking in the light of God, and the other people are the people in the darkness. And this darkness and light thing, these are the insurrectionists led by this prayer, led by what the person that's been commonly referred to as the QAnon shaman. So who knew the QAnon shaman was also a Christian revivalist inside the U.S. Senate? So here's this video, and then we can talk about it in a minute.
All the way back to the monument of D.C.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen.
Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Let me take it back. Thank you, Heavenly Father.
Amen.
For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs.
Yes.
That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
Amen.
Rather shocking, isn't it? This prayer. These guys take over the Senate dais. They're the villains in the story, but not in their own story. They're the heroes led by God, bringing about something good that the country can be reborn. Thanking God for the police officers, allowing them to come in. Like what you're seeing there is in some ways this extreme version of this conflict that happens internally in our country, that people are so afraid of the others. In their words, the communists, the globalists, the tyrants, and the traitors, and that they're the ones that are then walking in the light of God. So I mean, it's just full of. I've watched this so many times because it's Christian nationalism. It indicts whatever happened on January 6th and how it all came about. How these people walk unfettered around these spaces for this period of time, and they're recording it, and they're proud of it, and they see themselves as the good guys and as the heroes. I think all of those people now have been arrested and have been charged with crimes. I think a number of them are in jail. I'm not sure what they think about that now, if they've reconsidered, but that is this moment. It sort of strikes me as what happens in smaller ways in the rest of our society around so many of these issues.
I hadn't seen it. A couple of thoughts. I have the chills. It's very disturbing. I think about Lincoln. You've heard the quotation, America will never be destroyed from the outside. And that is as far as inside where they were as
Right.
it gets. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. Fascinating. I think about a lot of things percolating here, but Nazi Germany, and of course, anytime anybody brings up Nazi Germany, they're going to call you a freak and a fatalist and a fanatic, and how could you make the comparison? But a sophomore high school sophomore study of Nazi Germany will show that Hitler began his campaign in the 1920s. It wasn't with death camps, of course, and it was this kind of etching away at society through propaganda, through lies. It was Mussolini's idea of plucking one feather at a time. Millions of Christians backed this guy up.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be surprised at all by this idea of nationalism. But I think one thing Trump, and I agree with you that Trump, 6 years ago, none of this was happening.
That's right.
I wrote a blog post called Making America White Again, which referenced an interview that Patrick Buchanan did on NPR, where he said, essentially, we don't want to be a ethnically diverse nation. Ethnically diverse nations don't last. And the interviewer says, you realize what you're talking about. You realize the implication. He says, I don't care what people think. There was a time, and I talk about this in my video, where America was great based on ethnic
Yes.
reasons. But I think the main point with Trump, and if there are any Republicans listening, I hope you can hear me in this sense. I know you think I'm a rhino, but Hitler was a master at psychology and sociology. And one of the things that Hitler did, he's a master at, is just being angry. He was the greatest. He was as consistent as he was outraged at those things that are diminishing our nation. And we found out that most of them were benign, but he was really good at getting angry at Jews and gays and Romas and communists and others, right, from the outside. And this guy's talking about the communists. Like, really? Is communism a threat to this nation in 2022? Like, I remember communism. I'm 57 years old. We remember the Cold War, but is North Korea and the spreading of Marxist ideology like really a big threat in this nation? But Trump was amazing at demonizing the Democrats. He was fantastic at it. Like, every time he got up, he was raging mad, similar to Hitler. I'm not saying he wants to exterminate people. I'm just saying he was consistent and outraged at the threat of others. It was the caravans, it was the Muslims, it was the communists, it was the socialists. And let's face it, none of those things are existential threats. Those outside forces are not existential threats. As a matter of fact, the existential threat is what I talked about in my video. Sociologists saying that this project called the United States of America is not quite as stable as we think.
Yeah. Yeah, and the divide between people, this idea that we are going to see one another as the threat, is real. But I don't know that America has an other narrative. Like, we we've always mistrusted each other, right? And there's been debates in the United States about who do you trust and not. You go back into the 20s and 30s, you know, literally go back to Lindbergh, who's known famous for flying an airplane around, you know, around the globe for the first time. Also was the guy who coined "Make America Great," right? And his thing was a white only nation in the United States. So those arguments, and part of the reason that didn't want to get engaged in with Germany in what we now call World War II was didn't want to have the Jews sent to the United States, right? Like there was blockades in the United States Congress to not allowing refugees to come from Germany into the United States. So this stuff has been going on, right, for a very long time. And of course, you know, our great original sin of taking land that's not ours and exterminating and putting indigenous peoples onto reservations. So like there's been a series of practices that have sort of come along. And what I think you bring up so well is unless we reconcile some of that or find some way to not see one another only as the enemy, we're really in trouble. But I'm not sure we can do that. I mean, theoretically, of course we can. But practically, does the United States of America have the skill to pull this off? Do we know how to do this? It's a real question. And I think we don't, but I think we could develop it. And that's where what I thought was interesting about your notion of taking like personal development theory and aligning it with these topics is really interesting. Like, could we individually and collectively develop the skills to deal with these issues and to be able to look at ourselves in a way? Because here's what people will do. They'll watch that video. We'll watch the insurrectionist hearing on Thursday, and we'll say, those people, they did it. We don't say us. We don't say
absolutely.
we. I don't
Yeah.
tend to say, you know what we did as America? We attacked our capital. I say those
Yeah.
people attacked our capital. Like I separate
Yeah.
myself from and then we argue about who's the we and the people. And, you know,
Right.
we'll say,
Yeah.
well, I didn't enslave anyone. Other people did. And I didn't do this, but other people did. And so the question really becomes, can we, the people of this country, reconcile ourselves with ourselves? Is that possible? We're working on a little project that I'll talk to you about later because it really, another day here really dovetails into what you're doing. And it's a project on helping people overcome the divides in their most important relationships around these issues. So it's a project that's designed to say, can you develop a series of skills to allow you to reconcile with important relationships that you've lost because of religion and politics in the last
Yeah.
4 years?
Yeah.
Right. We're going to,
I'm keen to learn more about that. Push back maybe a tiny bit.
please.
3 quick things. What's different today, of course, versus in the 1960s is that the census says by 2040 or so, whites will be the minority in this nation. I think that is monumental. And I think many people that are tuned into white nationalism are very aware of that. Obviously, they're aware of that statistic. Most aren't. The second thing I'll say is, and I say this in my first video, and this is where I have hope. This is all theory right now. You and I, we're doing theory. It's like Bob Dylan says, and you who philosophize disgrace. Like we're philosophizing disgrace right now, and that's okay.
That's
But,
right.
and I say this in my first video, we can have a coworker who is I could be like the biggest Trump supporter in the history of the world, and I could have a coworker who is like contributes to AOC. And when we are with these people, whether they be aunts or uncles or coworkers or next door neighbors, all of a sudden they're not that bad of, like he's a really nice guy, but yeah, he's kind of a crazy liberal. But, for the most part, in our communities with those who think differently than us, we don't tend to see John, who works across the cubicle from me, who has a Bernie sign and I'm a Trump supporter, as an evil person. We might disagree with him. And so I tend to have hope if we can abstract from the abstract down to the local relationships. And in the recent video I talk about, I don't want to be wonky, but like, beliefs are the weirdest thing,
Yeah.
because ultimately we're talking about beliefs here. People believe this or they believe this, but we're under a great it's a fallacy to think that we can simply choose our beliefs. It's kind of crazy. Like, I believe in God. I can't, as a matter of will, decide right now, okay, I'm going to choose to not believe in God anymore, any more than you could choose that you're going to give, write $1,000 check to Ron DeSantis. Like, we can't simply, beliefs are complicated. We kind of find ourselves,
Yeah.
every one of us, whether it be along the big three, religion, politics, and science, we find ourselves with these convictions. Some are very intense, some aren't. But I think if we can understand that about our political enemy,
Yeah.
they really and I think you're doing a good job of this. Those guys that were praying, like, they really believed what they were praying.
Totally.
And they really, really believed that they were doing the ultimate justice to this nation in the name of Jesus. And I think you're brilliant in thinking this way, Doug. If we can come to understand that that's where they're not just bad fascists, which, I mean, the judicial system is going to put them in jail, many of them. But I think if we can, it sounds like your other project, if we can realize that these people really believe that, there's going to be a possibility, at least, of some sort of, mercy or understanding versus war.
So April 15th, 2018, Donald Trump came to Minneapolis area, just south of Minneapolis, actually a little area called Shakopee, to brag about the passing of the tax bill. And that stirred up a bunch of people that are like, we're going to protest when the president comes. It was also the time when he started to really turn on Ilhan Omar, my representative, the representative here in Minnesota. And said to her, go back to where you came from, and can't have, Somali Americans in Congress and all of this. So she's from here. So it really ramped up the pressure. Trump was going to go to a factory and say, this factory wouldn't be able to exist if we didn't do this important bill, which the irony of it is the factory was well working before they ever passed the bill. So apparently they didn't need that bill in order for the factory to work. So they probably should have gone to an empty field and said, someday there will be a factory here. But that kind of logic is not what they're up to. So this is in Shakopee, Minnesota, a small little 2-lane road leading into the factory. That's where the protesters against President Trump's coming to Minnesota and for Ilhan Omar, and then Trump supporters gathered on both sides of the road. This little teeny 2-lane road. I had a radio show at the time, and so I went down there to interview people on both sides. And so with a camera and a microphone, I walked back and forth across the road. Now, these are people in Minnesota, right? This is not a huge state. These are people that all were within driving distance of this small little road in Shakopee, Minnesota. You're talking about a small cohort of people in a state that's, not all that diverse. So I'd walk on one side with the Ilhan Omar supporters and then walk over to the Trump supporters. What I heard on both sides when I said, hey, tell me why you're here and what you're experiencing. People on both sides said this: I have no idea who those people are. And they would point across the road. I can't understand them for the life of me. Now, they really tended to look like there's more diversity on the Ilhan Omar supporting side, but not by much. These are people literally, like, they're all within driving distance, and they're saying, I cannot imagine who these people are. I don't get them at all. Right. So I'd go back and forth and hear it over and over. And then I would say to them, it's really interesting. That person over there with the yellow jacket on, he said the same thing about you. And they're like, we're not hard to understand. Like, both sides thought we're not hard to understand. They're hard to understand. It was really interesting. The other point that came out of it is the Trump supporters, people on the Trump supporting side, also added this to their narrative. They said, and you know what? I'm not a bad person for supporting Donald Trump. And it was funny. I would say, like, well, I didn't say you were a bad person. Like, why do you bring this up? It came up with almost everybody, some version of this. And they would say, oh, come on. I see you. You're walking over to that side. You think I'm a bad person, and my son thinks I'm a bad person, and my coworkers think I'm a bad person, and I'm not a bad person. Like the narrative that if you support Trump, you're a bad person, that had broken through to the people on that side. And this is the question that it was this moment where it was like, okay, the divide in this country isn't between strangers. The divide is also amongst those who are close to each other. And that same thing just built over years of the Trump administration with people in their very own families saying, feel like I don't even know who you are. You seem like an enigma that I can't possibly understand. And the lack of understanding among those close to us is what I think turns people into a threat with one another. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on that, or if that's something you've also experienced, or any thoughts about that.
Again, this is enriching this time with you. Um, it comes to this idea of silos, I suppose, and within a 50-mile radius, this group hanging with each other in whatever
Yeah.
settings. And my daughter lives in Boston, and she was recently in upstate New York, and we tend to think of New York as a liberal state. Of course, it is in the city, and it's not so much in the rural area. And she was in a rural area and went and got a drink with a friend, and um, was in shock. She's a progressive thinker, and uh, she was in this bar and just couldn't believe how, she just said it was a Trump rally, like just the shirts and the talk and she ended up talking to a lot of these people, and they had an agenda, and then she said they were very nice.
Yeah.
But I think of just that bar being a silo for a certain ideology, a certain way of thinking, and we see this geographically, and we haven't even started talking about red states yet,
Yeah.
or rural communities versus urban communities. I mean, I live in California. Uh, I'm biased, but I've lived here my whole life, other than 3 years I lived overseas. It's not going to hell. I mean, this is a freaking amazing country. I love Hollywood. I love Palm Springs. We have Silicon Valley. We have the beaches. We have the
Fruits and
redwoods. We
nuts.
have San Francisco. Like, it's not a
Yeah.
bad place. Um, I have friends moving the heck out because they live in a blue state. These are people that
Yes.
live in Orange County. We don't see homeless people here for the most part. It's beautiful. It's a really not it's a nice place to live. But now we have this idea of, well, I'm moving to Idaho, or I'm moving to
Yes.
Texas, or I'm moving to South Carolina because I live in a blue state and Gavin Newsom is a communist. And we're actually seeing this.
Yes.
One that really gets me, because I worked for the last 4 years for a NGO as a CEO in child welfare, and worked very closely with the Department of Health and Human Services, and in these urban areas like Ferguson or South Chicago or Oakland, or these places, or the Bronx. Trump had a narrative which was really
Mhm.
sinister to me, which is the problem is Democrat mayors, Democrat governors. I mean, that's sickening to me as someone who understands this space intimately well, that it's not that Democrats are, number one, Democrats are going to win in those areas because of the demographic. But I have to say that if it wasn't for the Democrats for many decades, including Lyndon Johnson, fighting for trying to invest money in these communities, God knows what those communities would be like. I'm not saying the Democrats have done it perfectly, but this trope that the
Yes.
problems with these inner cities is that they're run by Democrats, it's just it's untrue. But again, it's a way in which you can just divide. And so
Yeah.
the problem in California is we have a Democrat governor, even though there's a surplus, the economy's roaring here, blah, 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 blah. And again, it's another level of binary thinking that Trump brought in.
Well, and it brings up the point I think that we're getting at here is that it's about identity, right? So you ask a Republican, like, hey, what's your core thing? At some point they'll get around to, well, I think the federal government needs to stay out of it. And I think things are done better in the democracy of the states. Then you're like, but you're going to leave California because you have a Republican or because you have a Democrat governor. I thought, oh yeah, because now it's not about the federal government's overreach. It's not about unelected judges passing, legislation from the bench. Oh no, it turns out it's just I don't want to live in a state where the people in charge are these people, right? And I hear the same thing from my friends who live in states where the majority of elected officials are Republicans. I can't, this whole notion of red states, blue states, I'm not going to try to be, I'm not trying to be Barack Obama in 2004, John Kerry's inauguration or, nomination meeting where he said there's no red states and blue states, there's a United States. But this idea that this is how we classify it. You people have power, therefore I don't want to live in your world. It's not about the federal government. I mean, some people move out of cities because they don't like it that the nonpartisan mayor is really deep down a Republican or a Democrat, right? So there's something more going on. And what I'm afraid of is that we have a narrative in our heads and in our country and just sort of maybe in humanity that familiarity and closeness is what will solve these problems. And nothing could be further from the truth.
Absolutely.
Most violence in America is domestic violence. In other words, harming someone who you live with and have loved or do love. That the amount of how close you are to someone does not mean you're going to understand them or care for them. Look, human beings self-harm. Like, if anything should tell us that proximity and closeness, that you'd stop hurting yourself, right? You wouldn't live and you wouldn't talk about yourself the way you do in the quiet of your own head, right? Whether it's in fun or not, or you wouldn't think of yourself the way you do when you look in the mirror. So we're not going to get there by closeness. And I know that a lot of times we go to Germany, and we should, because you have an enlightened, powerful country that devolved over a decade and a half into one of the murderous places. But we should also think about Rwanda. What we've seen in more recent years is genocides in Rwanda, where tribal calls went out over the radio and neighbors started slaughtering neighbors in Rwanda. Like, we don't even want to talk about what went on there because it breaks the pattern that says, you know what, if our kids play soccer together, or if we work together, or if we share some common idea, let's just work on that which we all agree on. I just don't think that works. I wish it did. I've tried to explore it. There's just nothing in human experience. You look at African Americans in the military in World War II, in Korean War, and in Vietnam, and they're like, we were together on the battlefield, saved each other's lives. I got home and you said I couldn't eat in your restaurant. Like, it's just, there's no proof at all that proximity and closeness is going to be the solution. So I feel like we're out of ideas as a nation. Like, well, I don't know. Then what else do we do? Well, we thought education would do it, right? We thought, you know what we should do? Let's educate people. That'll solve the problem. And we still do this. I'm ranting for a minute. So give me a second here, Paul. Dan knows, we get about 58 minutes in. I start losing my mind. We say things like, well, you know what? If higher education is going to solve this. Oh, really? You want to talk about Josh Hawley, Yale educated? You want to talk about Ted Cruz, Yale educated? You want to talk about all the Yale educated lawyers and Harvard educated lawyers that were trying to overthrow the last election? Like, you go down the list of what we have thought would be the solutions: proximity, closeness, shared values, diversification, next generation education. And my gosh, I mean, in one way you said that the closeness, seeing the insurrection that close inside the Senate dais is really, it pinpoints it, and I'm with you. Other than the fact that a few hours later, senators went into that dais and did the same thing, still voted to not certify the election, right? And so did Congress people. So the call is coming from inside the House. Yeah, that's a real phrase. So I'm puzzled, and I think you're onto something. That's why I wanted to talk to you about this today. Like, okay, if I'm right, and I'm not just, and here's the crazy, I feel like I'm an optimist, and I think things are going to be okay. But I'm like, it's not going to be okay because we're just going to build a soccer field in the middle of town. We're all going to gather together in the town square, because the town square is also where people would, lynch other people, and people would stand around and cheer it. So I don't know, this like center set, let's find something to agree on and not talk about what we don't agree on isn't going to get there. So All right. We're philosophizing the problem. Well put. But
No,
do you
mean,
think there's something you got some hope for a
again, I'm an
post-impending
optimist like you, and the only thing that I'm very pessimistic, and in my video, I go through real things that happened. Originally we thought that these groups, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, were just about race, ethnicity,
Mhm.
skin color. And then they go up to Boise, and 31 of them get arrested because they were. And I start the video with celebrating. Progressives like to celebrate the United
Yes.
States. So we go and we have peaceful parades to celebrate our sexuality, and suddenly you have this group that was the Charlottesville group that actually was going to go do bad things, not because of skin color,
Right.
but because of sexual, to your word, identity. And so I am really pessimistic. The optimist is pessimistic
Mm.
because it gets back to that question of what is America? And these are irreconcilable ideas. And
Yes.
I say it over and over, and I beat the dead horse, um, that and I say tens of millions because not all Democrats are like AOC, or not all Democrats are like Kamala. Not all of them are, Kamala marched in San Francisco. Not all Tim Kaine probably didn't, maybe. I don't know. But my point
Let's say
is that
Joe
you have,
Manchin, let's say,
yeah,
probably
Joe
didn't.
Manchin certainly didn't. But you
Or
have
Kirsten
the,
Sinema, right? Kirsten Sinema, curiously, ran as a alternative life and lifestyle culture person. The the bisexual person from Arizona as a Democrat is with Joe Manchin on all this stuff. Like when it's Manchin and Sinema. So again, even things like that, that's not the whole story, right? There's these
yeah.
other. Sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah, no, I mean, she's an anomaly. But the point is, how do you reconcile a group that is giddy and raises hundreds of millions of dollars because they believe that this project is about radical
yeah,
liberty,
yeah,
almost like social libertarianism. Like, leave me the F alone. I want to live my gay or trans or queer or black or multicultural or whatever. Like, that is what the First Amendment is about. And yet this other side that believes that flamboyant
yeah.
celebration, that momentum, that thing we see is the threat to
That's right.
the entire project. I don't
Yes,
see how that's reconciled in any way,
I'm
shape,
with
or
you. Okay, so somewhere like in 1991, something like this, I was a pastor at a big mega church here in the area. I was just finishing seminary and moved between two places: a Christian bookstore on one given day. I was in a Christian bookstore picking up some curriculum for this job that I had.
remember those?
I do remember those. Yeah, this was a local Christian bookstore,
Right.
Northwestern Book and Bible. I remember it very well. I bought it when bought music and stuff there. So anyway, I was picking up something there, and they had a newspaper that was put out for the Christian community, like a little, small newspaper. They used to do those things too, called the Minnesota Christian Chronicle. And the cover story on it was how the radical left is wanting to destroy America and you're under threat. Something like this, right? That was on the cover. Later in the afternoon, I was in a coffee shop in Minneapolis, and it was a place that had a magazine out for the LGBTQ community called The Advocate. On the cover of that magazine, same, very similar shape and style and everything, was how conservative Christians are a threat to our country and are going to ruin who we are as a country. And I remember having these two in my hand in the car and this conversion like epiphany of this is what's going on. And one way I could have said it was, oh, the media is drumming this up. But both of these magazines have gone out of business. They were labors of love on both sides. But they
Right.
truly did see the other and were producing a newspaper with the cover saying the other is the threat. Truly, truly the threat. And that hasn't changed. That's probably just intensified. Now you could see it if the algorithms let you in split screen on your computer,
Right.
right? If
Oh,
you
yeah.
were um, the old algorithms of like if you go to the Christian bookstore, you don't
Right.
go to this coffee shop is how we kept those worlds apart.
Right. That was
Now
analog. That was
the
analog.
it was analog right now. The digital algorithm just repeats that, and people are very happy with it. We were very happy that those worlds never crossed, and we still want that to happen, which is why when you start breaking the rules and say like you're a progressive Republican or you're a progressive evangelical, people are like, whoa, like we know how these things land. That's it's like vegan meat. There ain't no vegan meat.
Right.
Uh, those are meant to be
But
up. And then you
but
get the Impossible Burger at Burger King, and you say, wow, that Whopper is actually really quite great. And it's where
But
it's going
there
from.
are, and this is when I ran for Congress, I had a little bit of a strategy and a theory, which was many of these total fiscal conservatives whose economic policy comes down to I want to pay lower taxes because I make $10 million a year. I mean, so many Republicans like the idea of lower taxes, obviously, because it saves them money. Like Plato said, democracy is the worst form of government. Every desire gets a vote. So lower taxes, but they're chill with same-sex marriage. And they don't think that the government should be messing with a woman's right to choose. And so I do think there is this space
Yeah.
on the right, and it's increasing. And now I live in Southern California. I live in California where it's not Tennessee or it's not, it's not the deep South. But one other thing I wanted to just very quickly add was centered around I don't remember.
Okay. When your own thoughts are so captivating, you can't move on to your previous
Yeah,
thought. That's
so
that's a good
so
sign.
riveting.
That
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah. Would have
that
changed
is
the
a
world.
good sign. Well, Paul, look, I think this stuff is worth talking about. I'm a big fan of talk therapy. I think it's good. I don't think it's just a waste of time. I think what we do when we talk about these things is we manifest worlds and we bring them into clarity, and they allow us to examine our impulses and our beliefs. And I know your third video, which people should watch, is about the relationship we have to our own beliefs. Uh, I really love that stuff. Like if people aren't familiar with philosophy of belief, it's really great. In fact, it undergirds a whole lot of things that we do in our society, like how does somebody beat an addiction, or how do you overcome a blockage in your life, or how do you lose weight and eat differently on Noom. It's all about the belief patterns that we're not choosing, especially in the religious community, because the community that I came from, the kind of evangelicals, really liked decision theology. In fact, Billy Graham had a magazine called Decision Magazine. It was all about decide. I've decided to follow Jesus. So you make a decision and you pivot, and you can make all kinds of decisions, but the beliefs that are still, like you said, are living rent free in your life, or the dark passengers, as the show Dexter put it, that travel with you as you move through life, they don't tend to go away easily. And they weren't put there by cognitive choice. They
No.
got there by a whole lot of other things. You have to all of a sudden start to investigate, like, why do I feel this way when I
Mhm.
talk about these things? Because it allows us to do things to one another and to ourselves that in moments of clarity, we would say, it was totally wrong for me to do that. If you've ever been in a relationship where like someone's yelled at you and then later they said, like, I'm sorry, I just kind of lost myself. And I like, yeah, but you also really did a harmful thing when you lost yourself like that. So what's going on there? And we just lose ourselves in this country when these topics come up, because you can say all you want, like, I'm into taxes. That's really what it's all about. But not really, because, or I
Yeah.
just want to protect people's individual freedoms to be who they are. And you're like, but that's not really the thing that terrifies me about, fill in the blank, Republican or extremist or something. So, all right. Well, anything else, Dan? Anything in that chat that we should definitely point out? I've been trying to read it a bit as we go. Is there something that you think would be particularly helpful? I didn't mean to put you on the spot if you weren't reading the chat there. Sorry
I
about
have
that.
been reading them, but it was a good, healthy chat. A lot of just questions like, how do I talk to someone who isn't even dealing with the same set of facts? Like, how do I talk to someone who
Yeah.
who isn't even agreeing on the same reality, and I think that is tough.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is what Paul is really getting at, is that if you believe somehow that you're ever talking to someone who's operating under the same set of facts, and believe you're not. Like this, I know that this has kind of become a thing that we use in our culture now, and we say a lot, like, because some politician said something that's just totally wrong. It's like quoting Einstein and saying that Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. No, he didn't. And no, it isn't. Okay. That's just a bad, in my view. It's just a bad. But this idea that, like, hey, you can have your same beliefs, but you don't get to choose your facts.
Yeah.
Yes, you do. People choose their facts all the time, because facts are made up of little data points, and data points are made up of what you think is important versus not important. And that actually comes back to the things that you value versus that you don't value. So you dig down deep on anybody's fact structure, and pretty soon the fact structure turns into a series of choices. So we don't operate like some 1950s police show where the facts and only the facts map. So I think the first thing we do when you feel frustrated in talking to somebody who doesn't start from the same starting point as you do is do everything you can to get to their starting point, rather than saying to them, you've begun at the wrong starting point, if you truly want to understand or you want to engage or something. And I'm not saying you give sympathy or you give credibility, but just start where they're starting, you know? And all of a sudden you'll realize that their ideas fall short just like yours do. Like, you think about any idea you hold really deeply for more than 20 sentences, and you let somebody make a run at you for 3 minutes who disagrees with you, you're probably going to start thinking, maybe I don't have this all tied up the way that I thought I did. That's a good thing. It's okay. Like, one side is not facts and the other side opinions, is I guess what I'm sort of turning into that postmodern philosopher. And I'm like, I can't believe we have to now tell Democrats to try a little postmodern theory on understanding how truth is constructed.
I would only add, and I could be accused as sounding elitist, but I'll go ahead and take it on the chin. Socrates had this fascinating concept that all evil is really reduces to ignorance. So taking Hitler, he was ignorant of the inherent value of human life. That would be kind of an example. And we are in interesting times in that anybody now can have access to information. And some people just, and I'm not trying to be rude, but just do not have the academic sophistication to be able to delineate just because something's in writing. Oh, I read it. Like, there is a group of tens of millions of people that just reduce reading something to being a fact. They don't understand that the New York Times cannot just make stuff up and put it on their front page, that they would have libel lawsuits. They don't understand that. And so all print is equal, where we know that Dan Rather was fired by CBS as one of the premier journalists of American history for fudging and exaggerating George W. Bush's track record in the National Guard. And so many people, and I would again say on the right more than the left, just don't quite understand that the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN in their news section, they don't know the difference between op-ed and news.
Yeah.
And that's a big problem, because everything they read, therefore, is in writing, and therefore it's a fact. That's a really tough one. I mean, really, it wasn't Trump supporters. Those were all Antifa people. I mean, how do you debate that? You can't.
Right.
So we're gonna tomorrow we'll have on as a guest our regular co-host, who's Paul Wallace, who's an astrophysicist and a pastor and a professor. And so we're going to talk about space, and we're going to talk about the James Webb Telescope. And every time we get into deep science stuff, which we do in this little chat that we have around here, I'm sort of reminded that to construct my understanding of science, I just have to decide to believe some people and not believe other people. I haven't done the math. I literally can't do the math on the James Webb Telescope. Like, if someone pushed me as like, other than the fact that someone told you that James Webb Telescope is taking pictures of, the past and light, that emanated billion years ago. How do you know that's true? Have you done your own research? No, I haven't. You know what I do? I talk to Paul Wallace and I get Scientific America and I read some things. That's how, in fact, most of my life is. If you asked me, was Bob Pagitt really your father? Did you ever do the DNA? Did you ever test it? Or did you just like go off what your mom and dad told you? I mean, really? That's what I'm like, okay, I could show you pictures of me when I'm 12, and my dad when I'm 12, or me right now and my dad when he was 56. Oh yeah, but that's not enough. Have you proved it? Of course not. In fact, most of the things you operate in your life around are things you've taken somebody's word for it. So what you end up with, and this is what the philosophy of belief tells you, is you're going to pick some chosen authority figures in your life. So when you meet someone who says something like, I think 9/11 was a conspiracy theory, or I think that, Trump did everything he could, or, fill in the blank, or I think Obama also separated families. No, they haven't done the research. In fact, if amateurs have done research on stuff like that, they're probably just looking up somebody else's research. Like, they're not out doing the research. Are you kidding me? They're just finding another set of authorities that they choose to give credence to. That's all we have. So I guess my point is, don't be hard on people when what they say is, I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from another. You've been messing around. That's a great song lyric, because that's all we've got. You heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody, and you believe it's true. And lots of ways we test that and we validate it. And, I have no reason to doubt my dad's, paternity. And I have no reason to doubt Paul Wallace is an astrophysicist and the James Webb telescope is up there. And I have no reason to doubt, that Temeculate's what brought down building number 7. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. I think that's utter nonsense.
I think we're wrapping up soon, but I think it's a great, if we are, it's a great way to conclude, because the research now done on the fragility of our democracy is largely based on the mistrust of institutions, which of course Steve Bannon and Donald Trump went after from day one. And we're talking about, I mean, when you've been to Washington, D.C., Doug, we've been there together. I remember the first time I went in, I think 2008, and you see these buildings like Department of Commerce, Department of State. And it's like, wow, this is a concept, but like thousands and thousands of people work in these departments, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the largest. You start to realize that perhaps in the case of your father, that's a kind of a micro case. But when it comes to conspiracy theories, let's say vaccinations, if you combine the WHO, the NIH, the CDC, the AMA, you're talking about tens of thousands of scientists, tens of thousands, who just because they work for the CDC or the NIH, they're all emailing, they're all in this together, trying to find a cure. And so what many people don't understand is when it comes to institutions, the CIA, which Trump attacked, the DOJ, you're attacking
the FBI,
the FBI. Like, we're not. It's and so I think that's again where we're in trouble, because now entire institutions, or you brought up government. Like, what is government? What do you explain to me what government is? I know it's at least 50 governors. I know it's 435 House members and 100 senators, right? But this thing is very complex. But you have people saying, well, the government, ...
Yep.
What the hell are they even talking about?
Yeah. No, I hear
Government.
you. Yep. And then, okay. Yeah. Okay. Flashback to yesterday. And then the Secret Service deletes a bunch of emails from January 5th and 6th. And you say to yourself, yeah, no, I think these people can do all. Trump leads an insurrection, and thousands of people who knew what he did on that day stayed silent until a committee put them under oath. Then they told the truth. So, yep. And this is the fragility even of our authority structures, right? Or, the same argument has been made about religion. Like, look, you're not going to get 2,000 years of conspiracy theories built up, or, oh no, you'll get exactly that. That's exactly how this thing goes. Like, the power of, so we're going to hold everything a little loosely. And when it doesn't function well, when I first came across Howard Zinn's The People's History of America, and like, oh yeah, the things I just knew as history that were not true, or the myriad podcasts I listen to that are like how they lied to you in kindergarten or revisionist history, or these are like, well, there's a piece of truth that people knew that I didn't know. So how did these people know it and I didn't know it? And who's been keeping this from me? And I realized, well, nobody's been keeping it from me. It's just, there's a lot. So we live in this fragile space of like, yeah, even when we get a lot of support for our ideas, and we should always hold it with a bit of humility. And as a religious person, a religious leader, I'll say, whenever somebody then says you don't have to because it's been blessed by God, so it now plays by a different set of rules, watch out for that one, because that's one of the older tricks in the book. So we have a fragility of belief, and we should have some contingencies in our beliefs. Doesn't mean you don't function. It doesn't mean I didn't say Happy Father's Day, or it doesn't mean that I don't, sit on a chair, even though I don't really understand the physics of how a chair can possibly work, because everything is atoms in motion. You still live your life. And I don't know where I'm going with any of that, other than it just sort of blows my mind. And the other day I heard the fact that 50% of our DNA in every human being is non-human DNA. And I was just like, I truly was on a walk listening to a podcast that was said. I stopped.
And that means it's true because you heard it on a podcast. Just like,
look at
when
that.
you read it.
Did you see that? That's pro move right there. That is a pro move.
I don't know how we missed this, Doug, but one of the things that has fascinated me around abortion is how, in talking about beliefs, I've been evangelicals, and you know this history very well. It was a response to liberal theology in the early 19th century, and the fundamentalists came together, and they had this kind of very rigid view of, we're going to look at the scripture, we're going to interpret it for what it says, and we're not going to add anything to it. And what has fascinated me in the last year is the brute fact, undeniable reality that abortion was widely practiced since the beginning of history. You can look at tools that were used, but in ancient times. And yet somehow the biggest issue that evangelicals who are Bible-based have in this country is abortion, something that is never mentioned in the scripture. And Jeremiah 1 is a joke for anybody serious about biblical interpretation, because it said, I knew you before you were in your mother's womb. So clearly he was talking about God's omniscience, not about
soul life.
Yeah, but I thinking of beliefs, I think there's an argument to be made, a serious argument for the importance of a sanctity of life, not in the blastula stage, but a little bit further down the road. But it baffles me, the abortion issue. If you look at the history, which I'm sure you know, Jim Crow and Bob Jones University, and how the Republican Party in the early 1970s, after the Southern Baptists 3 times upheld in their convention a woman's right to choose, the Paul Weyrich came along and said, we need a new issue. He picked abortion, and the rest is history. But for evangelicals, that they base that in scripture is I know nothing, because we're not supposed to add anything to scripture. Jesus and anyone in the scriptures who talked about caring for others talked about caring for the born, never one time for the unborn.
Yeah. Saw a little salutation in an email one time from somebody that said, don't believe everything you think. It's a great line, right? It sort of plays with that idea, right? Like, you think it, but hold it with a little bit of caution. And when you start knowing these histories, as you've done with the abortion debate, and sure, people will argue, and they should. Look, we were the Southern Baptists and the National Association of Evangelicals, who also supported Roe versus Wade when it passed in 1972. They were just wrong about that. We've learned a lot since then. They were wrong then. They're right now. Fair enough. And I'm like, okay, as long as we can go there, that the institutions you've trusted have been wrong, then it leaves the possibility that they're also wrong now, right? Like maybe they were right then and wrong now, because if they were wrong then and right now, then that seems like that's a possibility. So as long as you can get there, that there's something. But that's really hard for a lot of us, frankly, is to hold that, and then to not feel like somehow that capitulates to the other side and become alarmist about it. That also, that other little quippy joke, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you, is true. And just because, you maybe are alarmist about what the United States Supreme Court will do doesn't mean they're not going to do it. They very well could. I think a lot about when the 5 people on the U.S. Supreme Court like this idea of originalist thought, and you'd say something like, "Well, what would the founders or what would the writers of the Constitution have been thinking when they wrote this piece in the Constitution?" Well, first of all, what they'd probably be thinking if they were looking at the Supreme Court in 2022 was, they're all Catholics? What are you talking about? The Supreme Court can't be full of Catholics, because Catholics were a minority that were persecuted and kept out of leadership in the United States, right? So the idea that it's only the words and not the people, like, of course all this stuff changes. Like, it would have been just crazy talk to these people to have thought that the Supreme Court that's interpreting the Constitution are Catholics. Like, they couldn't even get beyond like, what would you, that would have been such a thing in that day, because they were the set aside group. So it's just so complicated, and this stuff is really hard. And so if anybody thinks our republic democracy is unshakable, it's just not. It's being made on a day by day basis. And we're probably all old enough that some remnant of it will be along as long as we're alive. So fair enough there.
Yeah, I
But
think
for
I think
other
also,
people,
I
it
mean, we
might
haven't
not be.
talked about guns yet, but to this idea of originalism, I think I'm right in saying that at the time, a firearm, the maximum shot per minute was 1, because it took a minute to take the old bullet out and put the new one in. There was no capacity, no pun intended, for these guys to have imagined magazines and AR-15s, and they couldn't have imagined. So now we're getting into hermeneutics ultimately, but there's just absolutely no way that we could be strict constructionists when it comes to an issue like guns, simply because an arm back then meant something very
Yeah.
different than what these people are spraying into classrooms
Right.
today. I'm sure our founders would have looked at that Second Amendment very differently had they known that, technologically speaking, we'd be in a very different place.
Well, and even the former Supreme Court from the middle 2000s and probably the current one would say, so of course the government can limit some weapons. You can't have a rocket launcher, even though I was at the NRA convention a couple weeks ago, and they had
Were you really?
rocket launchers there. Yeah, on the show floor. Which you can buy. You can buy a rocket launcher from them. The curious thing is, what you can't buy is the thing you propel out of a rocket launcher. So it'd be like you could buy a gun, but you can't buy bullets. And of course, people would say a machine gun, like an automatic weapon. Yeah, we can ban a machine gun, colloquially called a machine gun. Well, okay, then you're just picking how many bullets per second you can fire. So if you can ban one, or a rocket launcher, of course you can ban, like, people can't have armed drones, all kinds of things they can't have that you'd call arms. So it's just a ridiculous argument that it's the Second Amendment. Okay, we won't go off on that. We'll do it another time. Paul, would you come back and we can go off about guns for a while?
I'd
Because
love
it's
to, but
also maddening.
as we get to the end of this at some point, Doug, I really
There's
do
no
think
end. It's all a big circle and a big
it
well that would
it
just
comes down, and this is what
Dante's.
I tried to say unsuccessfully: loyalty.
Mm.
Why do we die for our sports teams? Why is there this? Why do I love the Dodgers? I grew up in Southern California. I really do like this team. It's really irrational, because if I would have grown up in where you live, I would feel the same intensity for the Twins, most likely, or the Vikings, right? Maybe not. But we do have these, in a benign sense, these loyalties to, say, a sports team. And then, I grew up Roman Catholic. We have these devout loyalties to the denomination of
Mhm.
which we were raised in many cases. And that's fairly benign. But when it comes to my political party, and my political party espousing policies that are destructive to the lives of innocent people. I was talking to a lady the other day, and she's a mom, and I said, "Hey," and I know she's a Republican, and I said, "Hey, just help me understand, this is right after the shooting in Chicago." And I said, like, "What about these semi-automatic guns?" And she said, "Well, we have a major mental health issue in this country that
Yeah.
we need." This is the talking point, of course, of the right. And she said, I just want to say my husband is law abiding. He's never been arrested. And him and his friends have the right, because he has an AR-15. I didn't know this about her at all. He has an AR-15 and they take him to the shooting range and they do it, they do it safely and they love doing that. And their right should not be taken away. And I kind of reduced that so it's really important for your upper middle class husband to go with his buddies and play with toys.
Yeah.
Like, really, that's where this is a mother. Like, there was no sense of these weapons are meant to blow big gaping holes in the enemy's bodies to kill them. And I just thought, is this where we're at as a nation, where a mother can't say, you're right, my husband can, get a video game or, get a single shot gun. But her argument was he has the right to go have fun with his friends.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I know nothing about anything anymore.
That's right. And somehow that person's probably an otherwise not so complicated person, maybe even a really lovely person, probably does some really good things in the world. And then there's this, and it just makes you get that turn of the, like a dog with the turn of the head look, like, really? Okay. Well, this is, and this is people turning on one another. I bring this up a lot, so regular listeners and anybody who's like listened an hour and 31 minutes already is like, you're a regular around here to this conversation, or if not, you ought to count yourself as one. The Hebrew scriptures begin with the story of the Son of God having a son who kills the other son of God. Right? So what we're dealing with is a human condition that kills one another. So if you start there, not going to depravity or anything, all that nonsense, theological explanations, people kill each other. Call it a mental health crisis, whatever you want. Well, the one thing you'd want to do, what you're not going to do in the human condition is get rid of people. And the other thing we're not going to do is get rid of people that have a mental health crisis. They're going to be around. So if the problem is the combination of of mental health crisis and dangerous weapons, only one of those two things can you get rid of. So maybe until we solve the mental health crisis, we should just get rid of the other half of the equation, right? Like just temporarily. Let's say the next 5,000 years of human development until we solve mental health issues that seem to be in the United States differently than anywhere else in the world. Maybe until we solve that problem, we should just stop this bad combination. I don't know why that argument isn't being made by more people instead of...
Why are you being so practical, Doug?
Yeah, because, when people say like, people don't kill people, guns kill people. I have a friend that says, well, actually bullets kill people. And if you really want to solve this problem, let people have their guns and just make bullets, inaccessible. It's a pretty good argument. Like no more, you can't make any more bullets until once they're all gone, then they're all gone. It's another argument to the whole thing. Because you're not going to solve the human crisis. So maybe solve the other one.
What New Zealand did, or Australia did still, again, but that's just, we're dealing with rational, pragmatic solutions, the buyback issue. But again, you were at the cult gathering in Houston. I'm going
to do a whole explanation video about what happened that day sometime here, but I'll just
can't. I mean, I've been to a Republican, and I'm sure you have, convention or gathering. Oh, yeah. That was weird enough, but I can't imagine
the floor, the 110 acres of demonstration booths and stuff, in the convention center at Houston for the NRA convention in August or in May here that I was at, was unbelievable. In order to get in, we had to pay money to get in. And the only way you can pay money to get in, which I wanted to do because I really want to hear from these people and learn from them. So the $35 that I paid for two of us to get in wasn't that bad of a deal. But the only way you do that, because you can't just pay to go in, you have to become a member. So you buy a 1-year membership for two people for $35. So now technically I'm a member of the NRA. So as an NRA member, I want to say, let's shut this organization down. It's a terrorist group and it needs to end. I'm saying that as an NRA member.
Right.
Which I'm totally opposed to. But then that caused this morning, just before we came on, for me to get a toll-free phone call, which occasionally I answer, and I chose to on this particular moment. And it was somebody from the NRA saying, do you want to update your membership for 5 more years? So they're fundraising. And what did he say? He said, well, and I said, well, like, what do you do with the money? If I do this. And he said, well, as you know, and then he starts describing Joe Biden and all the things they're going to do. And it all goes to identity. So the thing that they were saying on the fundraising call to me was, you have to help us to stop these bad people, because all the Democrats and 2 rhino Republicans voted to do this, and Canada is going to do this, and starts to build a world like an anime, cartoon, builds a false world that then says, here's what's coming if you don't update your membership. It wasn't about it wasn't about laws or anything. It was about, we have to protect the Second Amendment, and you have to help us do that because these people want to take it from you, and started naming names. And I was just like, when we were coming into this conversation, I was just like, there it is, right? Like, it's not about policies or not about anything. They didn't say the gun bill is this or that. It was just all about, you can't let Joe Biden have any more power. You can't let AOC and Nancy Pelosi, do all. So it was, your team is going to lose if their team.
And it goes not trying to pimp my show, but it again goes to one side that is progressive in terms of diversity and celebration of diversity, and the other side's afraid. And what he said is, you better give us money because this is happening. We got to shut it down.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at.
And funny enough, then when I said to him, well, like, what do you actually do with the money? He said, well, we always do. And I said, yeah, but what is that? And he said, like, we buy TV commercials. So I said, I'm not interested in giving you money to buy TV commercials, which is true, but also it was just inane. Like, okay, really? Like, your response to whatever big cataclysm you've just described about how we're going to lose America because the Second Amendment's going to go away. And then your response is that I update my membership for a 5-year that I'm going to get a deal on. I'm only going to pay for 2.5 years. So first of all, really, I'm committed to saving America, but I want to save $1. And then what you're going to do with that money that I saved $1 on was buy a TV commercial? Like, it's just insane. So you realize it has nothing to do with the TV commercials, has nothing to do with the tote bag that I was offered or duffel bag that was embroidered that I was offered. It just all had to do with, you did a good thing today. You helped the good people do the good thing. And there it is, right? That even the people breaking into the Capitol see themselves as the hero. And boy, if we don't start in any conversation with our friends with the belief, with the recognition that the other person believes that they're the hero, they're not the villain. They might be the victim, of heroes, villains, and victims. You might be the victim.
Mm-hmm.
You probably are the hero. You're certainly not the villain.
It's fascinating.
Which is a thing. All right. Is that enough? Hour, 37 minutes and 42 seconds of talking about all this?
No, it's been great. I've enjoyed it. It's been a while.
All right. Well, thank you. And, enjoy your lunch now that you've woken up in California at 8 a.m. and you're now approaching lunchtime. So thanks for sticking on. Hey, and everybody that listens, Dave and Clayton and Peggy and just all the people over here. I'm sort of scanning Mike, Jim, all of you for your Steve, Nan, all the people. And if you're on one of our streams and you don't see all these comments, it's because they come from YouTube and they come from Twitter and they come from Facebook and all those places. The only real place to watch this, though, is on YouTube, which is also where you can find Paul Martin's work and the Paul Martin Show, which could lead you to an antiques show on YouTube. It's also probably worth your time, but make sure you find this Paul Martin when you're looking for all that over there. The other Paul Martin, just like the flight of the Conchords thing, where they're like, we're the third New Zealand's third most famous pop band, right. Or pop rock band. Right. The second most famous Paul Martin on YouTube. All right, is that good, Dan? Anything else from you?
No, that's good.
Speaking of lunch, for you, it's like 2:00 in the 1 o'clock, and
time to land the plane.
All right, hey, hey, let's land the plane and see you tomorrow. We're going to be talking with astrophysicist Paul Wallace. So get your astrophysicist self on the podcast tomorrow. If I go for another 45 seconds, we'll make an hour and 40 minutes, which will be our 5th longest podcast ever. In other words, we can go longer. All right. Anything else? Anybody? Go to the order. All right. We'll try to find a way to love each other, would you?